All right, you guys, welcome back. Unit 3.1, Ecosystems, Stability, and Change. Now we're moving on to part 3, which looks at interactions in an ecosystem. So you guys ready, set, and let's go. So the first thing that we need to talk about is something called a niche. So the niche is a full range of physical and biological conditions in which an organism lives. So where does it live? What kind of temperature does it need? Where in the ecosystem does it live, in the trees, in the ground, etc.? How much water or light does it need? And the way in which the organism uses those conditions. So things to consider when we are talking about the niche of an organism is the type of food that it eats. So what type of food does it get? How does it get that food? Does it store it? Does it eat it right away? Does it somehow modify it? Also, which species will use that organism as food? So what is it a prey item to? The physical conditions an organism requires to survive. Again, like how much water or food does it require? How much space? Where in the ecosystem? Trees versus shrubs versus top of the soil versus under the soil versus in water? And when and how it reproduces. So does it need certain conditions when it reproduces? Does it need excess moisture to lay eggs in, etc.? So I give you some examples. Here we have 3 types of warbler. Now they're all a certain kind, or they're all related, they're all warblers, but they live in different parts of the tree. So that's something that they don't have to compete for. They don't have to compete for territory. So they might compete on some levels for foods, but not always a whole lot because, again, they're looking at different parts of the tree. This one's going to feed more so from the top. This one's going to feed and live more so in the middle. This one's going to feed and live more so near the bottom. All right. Yeah. Now we have these things called community interaction. So this looks at how different organisms within that community, whether they're organisms of the same population or organisms of different populations, how they interact with each other in their community and in their ecosystem, because that's going to affect their niche. So the 3 main types of community interactions, at least the 3 that we're going to discuss, are competition, predation, as well as symbiosis. Now in all of these, you've heard me talk about organisms needing resources. So resources are anything that's necessary for life. So what kind of things would be necessary? Well, water would be necessary. Nutrients would be necessary. Light, especially if you're a plant, is necessary. Food would be necessary. Space, territory, especially if you have to build a nest or a den, would be necessary. Mates would be necessary, etc. Now, before we move on, we do have something called the competitive exclusion principle. Now, what this states is that no 2 species can occupy the same niche at the same habitat at the same time. And that doesn't mean that they can't compete. It means they cannot compete for every single resource. Because if they're competing for every single resource, then their niches are much, much too similar. And that's going to lead to too much competition, which means either one will survive and thrive in that ecosystem. The other is either going to die out or have to leave and go find a new ecosystem with which to make its own niche. Here's an example. All 5 of these birds live in the same area. However, they feed on different types of things and as well as in different areas. So here we have the flamingo. It'll feed on small mollusks, crustaceans, vegetable, etc. It's got these longer legs like stilts so it can walk into the deeper parts of the water where the other birds can't go. So it can eat that way. Now the duck is gonna feed on some similar things. along with some things that the flamingo won't feed on. But it's going to stay in the, not super deep part because it's going to just kind of dip its head down, tail up in the air, and try and feed that way. So it's not going to go as far into the water as the flamingo was. So even though they're competing for certain types of food, they're not in a whole lot of competition because they're feeding in two different areas of the same water source. The avocets feed on insects, small marine invertebrates, and seeds, but they're doing it in much, much shallower water than the duck. The oyster catchers can eat worms, crabs, bivalve plant shells like oysters, clams, but it's going to do it again where the water is very, very super shallow, so very different place than these others. And plovers are going to look for invertebrate or very, very small invertebrates as well as insects. And it's not going to go in the water at all. It's going to stay at the water's edge. So again, very similar to that picture we saw a couple of slides ago. We have 5 different warbler species of birds here. They're going to feed on very, very similar foods and the same kinds of seeds and even be within the same tree, but they're going to stay to different sections of that tree. So because they're foraging in different sections and parts of the tree, they're not going to be as much in direct competition, even though they are looking for the same food. So this is just kind of showing you a little bit about more of a abstract way of thinking about it. We have species B, species C, and they do overlap on some stuff that they're competing for. That's the interspecific competition. So the niches overlap a bit. Now they can still survive. One of them might, evolve or develop adaptations that would completely separate it from competition with, so I'm trying to get my sandal, it can go through natural selection, acquire adaptations that would take it out of competition completely with species B. And that can be either by, maybe one hunts during the day, one hunts at night. One forages in the top of the tree, one forages in the bottom of the tree. So there's ways to overcome the competition. They're not necessarily in direct competition, but by switching maybe when or where they hunt for the same food sources, they're no longer competing for it. All righty. Let's talk about predation. Now I know we've talked about this in a previous slide. We said predation is when one organism is going to capture and feed on another organism. So here we have some examples of that. We have the otter caught and is feeding on the fish. We have a cheetah catching and hopefully catching and feeding on the gazelle-like animal. Here we have a praying mantis eating some other kind of insect. So all of these, they are catching and feeding on something else. So the predator is feeding on the prey. These are interactions. Not necessarily good for the prey, but it's not necessarily bad for the population because it helps the populations to stay healthy and it keeps either one from overpopulating and thus causing chaos and destruction or damaging the ecosystem. All right, symbiosis. So symbiosis is when you have a relationship between two species and they're living in a very, very close relationship. Now in all symbiotic relationships, one organism, one species is going to benefit. What occurs with the other species is going to determine what kind of symbiotic relationship it is. We have 3 kinds of symbiotic relationship: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So this picture here does a very good job of summarizing it. In mutualism, both species benefit. They get something good out of the relationship. In commensalism, one individual benefits, the other doesn't get anything. It doesn't get anything good, but it also is not harmed by the relationship. In parasitism, one organism gets something good, the other is harmed by it. And we have some examples, as well as definitions. So here we have mutualism. And like we said, in both cases, in all cases, both species benefit. They get something good out of the relationship. Here with the clownfish and the sea anemone, the clownfish get protection because sea anemones can sting, but they don't get stung by the sea anemone, so it offers them protection. And when other fish might try and go after the clownfish, they could be stung and eaten by the sea anemone. So they both get something good. Clownfish gets protection, sea anemone gets food. The bee and the flower. The bee gets food when it goes to the different flowers. It gets nectar and all that. Pollen sticks to its legs, and as it goes from one flower to the next, it can fertilize the different flowers with the pollen that's stuck to it. So the bee gets food, the flower gets help during reproduction. And down here, we have a crocodile with a little birdie. That crocodile is not going to eat that birdie. He just comes out of the water, opens his mouth. The bird flies in all on its own. The bird's actually going to eat the different mites and maybe some parasites or gunk that's left over in between the teeth of the crocodile. So the bird is acting like a dentist. He benefits because he gets food and protection, because no one is going to go and try and get that bird while it's sitting in a crocodile mouth. So the bird gets food and protection. The crocodile gets its mouth cleaned, and a lot of the irritants that could lead to infection are removed by the bird. Next, we have commensalism. So this is where one member of the relationship benefits, gets something good, and the other member gets nothing out of it. Nothing good, but also nothing bad. So here we have some examples. Got a whale here. Let me move my camera so you can see a little bit better. So we have the whale, and you'll notice that there are some barnacles that are attached to the whale's skin. Now barnacles, they're filter feeders, and they don't really move a whole lot. So once they attach to a surface as larvae, they're stuck there for life. Now as filter feeders, they need water flowing constantly around them in order to pick out the little things floating in the water column that they can eat. Well, by hitching a ride on a whale, they get access to flowing water all the time. So they get constant food source. It's like a barnacle buffet. So they get something good. They get access to lots and lots of food. The whale gets nothing out of it. They don't help the whale get food or help the whale survive, but they also don't affect the whale in a negative way. They don't hurt the whale, and they don't affect the whale's ability to swim. So the whale gets absolutely nothing. Down here, we have a shark, and I think they're called remora fish. All they do is they hang out with the shark. They're kind of like its little groupies. Nothing is really going to go after the fish to try and eat them because they're swimming way too close to the shark. So they get protection. They don't hurt the shark. They also don't help the shark get food because things are going to stay away from it. So the shark gets nothing out of it. It's not helped, but it's not harmed. And over here, we have a butterfly taking a rest on a frog that's in the water. Now, the butterfly gets something good. It gets a spot where it can rest its wings. If it was to land on the water, it could more likely be eaten up by a fish or something like that. Now, the frog's just chilling anyway, so he doesn't really care that the butterfly is there. He's not going to eat it. He's not going to get any benefit from it. It doesn't help him get food or survive. But the butterfly just sitting there also doesn't hurt it, so it doesn't get anything out of it. All right, and parasitism. So parasites are organisms that live on or in another organism, and they harm it. So they get something good out of it, either food, care, etc. And the host, what they are living on, gets harmed by it. So for instance, ticks, they attach to animals, they'll burrow their head in, and they will feed on the blood of the organism because there's nutrients in the blood. However, they can actually pass on diseases to their host. Same with mosquitoes. They can attach, they feed on the blood, they get nutrients from it, but there's a chemical in their saliva that also makes it super itchy, which is why they itch like crazy afterwards, and they can pass on diseases. Here we have a tick. Sorry, not a tick, a leech. The leech attaches on and it feeds off of the host, feeds on their blood. Here we have a certain parasite that it swims into the mouth of the fish. It eats the tongue of the fish, and then it will kind of attach itself to where the tongue was and just live there. When the fish eats food, that parasite has first access to the food. So it gets to eat the food that the fish is trying to eat for itself. So that means there's less food for the fish, and that's going to harm it. Plus, not even for including the part that it ate its friggin' tongue. And here we have, you'll notice that those are definitely two different species of bird. Now, some species like kiwis and I believe cuckoos, what they'll do is they will lay their eggs in the nests of other birds. So what happens is, or that's the case here, this baby bird, its egg was laid in this mama bird's nest. Now, the baby birds are very loud and insistent. So mama bird, her instincts are to feed the loudest baby bird. So he's going to get a lot more of the food than any of her babies. In fact, sometimes the bird that laid the egg for this baby, sometimes she'll even push the other eggs out of the nest so that her baby gets all the attention. So now we have this other species of bird, this mama bird here, who is raising another bird's baby, and that could lead to neglect of her own eggs and babies, or like we said, the other mom could have pushed the eggs out, which means that it would have killed the eggs. All right, just kind of a summary picture. Mutualism, both get happy faces because they both get something good. Commensalism, happy face because one thing gets something good. Meh because he's unaffected. And parasitism, happy face because the tick feeds on the cat. Sad face because the cat is harmed, it gets irritations on it, could lead to infections or diseases, etc. All right, let's talk about something called biodiversity. So we mentioned this term in the beginning of the chapter. Bio means life and diversity means variety. So we're looking at the variety of species within an ecosystem. Now, what we have found is that complex relationships in ecosystems mean that a change in a single biotic or abiotic factor can have a variety of effects, both large and small, on many different species. Now, we've actually found that the more biodiverse an ecosystem is, the healthier it is. And if we look at this picture, we can see a wide variety of different life. Each of those different types of coral are different species of living things. We have different kinds of fish. There's probably bacteria living in the fish. There's bacteria that live with the coral and help them do photosynthesis. So there's lots of different living things going on here. Plus, there's probably things we can't even see because they're burrowed in the rocks, like eels or crabs or other types of crustaceans or cephalopods like an octopus, etc. So let's talk about what a keystone species is. A keystone species is a species within an ecosystem that have an especially strong effect on the entire ecosystem. So that means that they have such a big effect. If something happens to this particular species, it will affect every other species in that ecosystem. We have this example here. The beavers build their dam. Now, what that does is it's going to cause the water level on this side to rise up. Now, when that occurs, it's going to turn some of the terrestrial ecosystems into aquatic ecosystems. So organisms that once lived on the land that was there have to be relocated. They're being affected. They're losing their home. And it is becoming an aquatic ecosystem. So now water-based organisms can move in. Okay. So it's just kind of looking at it again in a little bit more detail. So here we have the beaver. It makes this dam, and then it gives you some examples of different species and how they are all affected by it. So fish, amphibians, dragonflies, marsh plants, water birds will thrive in the pools that are built behind the dam. Let's see, red deer wildcat, cattle, black stork, wild boar, they're all can kind of drink and eat some of the fish that are accumulating there. When there's a lot of rain, beaver dams hold back the water in natural valleys. So that means that there's less flooding down here that would affect these animals. Large grazers eat from the twigs of the felled trees. So the twigs that broke off when the beaver cut or chewed down the trees, they're going to feed on those. Here we talk about martens kind of moving in and taking over some of the old beaver dams. Down trees are loved by woodpeckers and bats as they serve as a lookout for birds of prey. So it's giving you all these different ways that these organisms are being affected by the presence of beavers. And here's another example. So I'm not going to go through all of it, but this is an example of wolves. So the presence of wolves. Wolves are keystone species. This talks about all the different ways that they affect it. Their leftovers can help feed different scavengers. They keep grazers on the move, so this way it prevents the deer from overgrazing in one area and thus disrupting the producers in that area. So again, they just kind of give all these different ways that wolves help and affect other species. Mm-hmm. So factors. There are some negative factors that can change and actually reduce biodiversity in an area. Like we already said, the more biodiverse an area is, we know that the healthier the ecosystem is. It's more stable, which means if an ecosystem is damaged, then it has higher resilience to recover from that damage and actually more resistance to being damaged in the first place. But there are certain things that can affect it and reduce the biodiversity, thus having negative effects. One is human activities, how we use pesticides or we deforest for land use. That's going to affect the ecosystem and it actually can wipe out numerous species, or even if it affects one keystone species, then as we said, that keystone species can affect the rest of the ecosystem. Also invasive species. So these are when new species are introduced to an area. Like here we have one of those murder hornets. Now the thing about these hornets or other invasive species is when they are introduced to a new ecosystem, they have no natural predators. So nothing is going to feed on them. As a result, they're going to find things to feed on and survive off of. And that means that they're taking prey away from other predators, which can then cause the predators to starve and die. And since nothing feeds on the invasive species and nothing has a natural defense against the invasive species, they can decimate prey populations and completely overpopulate an area. So they do tend to have these very negative effects and affect the entire ecosystem, oftentimes resulting in species dying out in that ecosystem. All right, and last but not least, our additional resources. Ooh. So first we have Science in Pajamas. We have a video on community interactions and one on the different symbiotic relationships. Then for our other videos, we have Amoeba Sisters Ecological Relationships. We have Few School Ecology Interspecific and Intraspecific Interactions. We have Bozeman's Science on Communities. We have Few School, What is a Niche? And a TED Ed talk, Why is Biodiversity so important? So I recommend you checking some of these out to kind of help with your understanding, explain some of the same things we talked about in different ways. They're also tend to be more visual. But yeah, I mean, if you have questions, you know where to find me. Give me in Google Classroom, email, or in class. But in the meantime, you guys, just stay awesome, stay amazing, and I'll talk to you guys later, all right? All right, stay healthy. Have